Del Norte County, Northern California. 13 miles from the Oregon border, where dense coastal redwoods meet the cold, fog-drenched coastline of the Pacific Northwest. From above, it looks like a modern industrial complex dropped into the middle of an isolated forest. Up close, it is a 275-acre concrete fortress wrapped in double-layered perimeter fencing, motion sensors, and high-voltage lethal wire. This is Pelican Bay State Prison, California's first purpose-built Supermax facility, opened in December 1989 around one brutal design philosophy: total control through total physical isolation. It was engineered as an architectural answer to escalating prison violence. As powerful gang networks grew inside California's correctional system through the 1970s and into the 1980s, state authorities designed Pelican Bay's security housing unit, known as the SHU, to sever communication between high-risk individuals and the outside world. Built as an X-shaped complex of windowless concrete cells, automated sliding doors, and solitary exercise pens, the facility held men in isolation for over 22 hours a day. Over 3 decades, Pelican Bay became the ultimate end of the line for California's most dangerous offenders, a place where sensory deprivation was built directly into the walls. 5 files sit inside this facility's history. A motel handyman whose summer-long killing spree near a national park sparked one of the largest FBI manhunts in California history. One half of a violent duo whose crimes against teenage girls in 1979 became known for the tools used to commit them. A legendary criminal figure who became the first non-Hispanic leader of a powerful prison organization, directing operations from deep within the concrete matrix. A high-ranking gang lieutenant who spent nearly a decade running criminal networks from solitary confinement before making a choice that reshaped federal prosecutions and, decades later, walked free. And a key figure from a historic 1971 prison uprising who spent 24 consecutive years inside Pelican Bay's isolation unit, among the longest such confinements in modern American history. This is Prison Files. If you're new here, hit subscribe. We open a new prison file 3 times a week. Case number 1. Cary Stayner. Between February and July of 1999, fear spread through the small communities bordering Yosemite National Park. A predator was operating around the quiet motels and scenic highways of Mariposa County, targeting female visitors before vanishing into the surrounding forests without a trace. The disappearances began on February 15, 1999, when 42-year-old Carol Sund, her 15-year-old daughter Julie, and their 16-year-old exchange student friend, Silvina Peloso, failed to return from a sightseeing trip. Their rental car was discovered weeks later, burned in a remote forest area, containing the remains of Carol and Silvina, while Julie's body was recovered 40 miles away, near a reservoir. For 5 months, the investigation struggled despite one of the largest task force operations in FBI history. Investigators interviewed dozens of potential suspects, including local parolees and resort workers, while media coverage drew nationwide attention to the park. The break in the case came on July 21, 1999, following the disappearance of 26-year-old naturalist Joy Ruth Armstrong, who was found slain near her cabin inside the park boundaries. Witnesses reported seeing an older utility vehicle near Armstrong's home around the time of her disappearance, leading agents directly to a 37-year-old motel maintenance worker who had already been questioned during the initial searches months earlier. His name was Cary Stayner. Stayner was born on August 13, 1961, in Merced, California, the first of 5 children. His childhood was overshadowed by family tragedy. In 1972, his younger brother Stephen was abducted by a child predator and held for over 7 years before escaping, an event that placed the family under intense and prolonged public scrutiny. Stayner grew up with quiet behavioral issues and deep-seated resentments that went largely unaddressed, eventually finding steady employment as a handyman at the Cedar Lodge Motel just outside Yosemite's main entrance, where Sund, her daughter, and Peloso had been staying. To guests and co-workers, he appeared to be an easygoing, unremarkable worker who kept to himself, even as he privately planned his crimes. before Stayner's arrest. The case had already taken a wrong turn that would later draw its own scrutiny. Investigators had spent months building a case against 3 unrelated men with no connection to the murders, relying in part on a jailhouse informant whose account later fell apart. Those men were released without charges once Stayner's confession made clear the true scope of the investigation's error, a detour that cost the task force critical time, while the real offender continued working at the same motel where the victims had stayed. On July 24, 1999, FBI agents located Stayner at a resort in Laguna Seca and took him into custody. During subsequent interviews, Stayner provided a full confession, describing how he had lured his victims under false pretenses before killing them. He told investigators he had fantasized about committing similar crimes for years before acting on them, and that Armstrong's murder had been an act of self-preservation once he believed investigators were closing in on him. He was tried first in federal court for the murder of Joy Armstrong, since her death occurred on federal parkland. To avoid a possible federal death sentence, he pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, kidnapping resulting in death, and attempted aggravated sexual abuse resulting in death, receiving a sentence of life imprisonment. He was later tried by the state of California for the murders of Carol Sund, Julie Sund, and Silvina Palazzo. During the trial, prosecutors presented Stayner's own recorded confession as the centerpiece of their case, describing in his own words how he had killed the mother and the exchange student inside their motel room before driving Julie to a remote reservoir the following day. The defense argued Stayner suffered from a lifelong mental illness, rooted partly in the trauma surrounding his brother's kidnapping, and asked the jury to spare his life on those grounds. In August 2002, the jury rejected that argument, convicting him on all counts and recommending a sentence of death, which the trial judge imposed for each of the 4 murders. Stayner's case has remained tied up in California's long-running moratorium on capital punishment, in place since 2019, with no execution carried out in the state since 2006. As California works through a court-supervised program transferring its condemned population out of San Quentin, where death row was long housed, reporting on Stayner's current placement has been inconsistent. Some accounts describe him as still held on death row as his case moves through appeals. Others, including reporting tied to the state's transfer program, place him at Pelican Bay State Prison in Crescent City. What is confirmed is that no court has vacated or commuted his death sentence, and Stayner remains condemned under California law, regardless of which facility currently holds him. His case a continuing footnote in the state's unresolved relationship with capital punishment. He has not been eligible for parole and is not expected to become eligible under the terms of his conviction. Case number 2, Roy Norris. In late 1979, law enforcement across Southern California began investigating a series of violent disappearances involving teenage girls. The victims vanished from suburban streets and transit stops across Los Angeles County without warning, most last seen accepting a ride from strangers along busy roads where hitchhiking was still common. It was not until police connected a survivor's account to a customized van that investigators uncovered a pattern of predatory behavior coordinated by 2 men operating together. The perpetrators were Lawrence Bittaker and his associate, 31-year-old Roy Norris, a duo the press would come to call the Toolbox Killers. Norris was born on February 2, 1948, in Greeley, Colorado. He accumulated a criminal record early in life, including arrests for sexual assault and robbery, which led to a prison term at San Quentin, where he first met Bittaker in the mid-1970s. The 2 men discovered a shared fixation during their time together in custody and began planning a crime spree well before either was released. Following their release, they reunited in Southern California and outfitted a windowless cargo van specifically to facilitate abductions along the Pacific Coast Highway, giving it a sliding side door that could not be opened from the inside. Between June and October of 1979, the pair targeted 5 teenage girls: 16-year-old Lucinda Schaefer, 18-year-old Andrea Hall, 15-year-old Jacqueline Gilliam, 13-year-old Jacqueline Lamp, and 16-year-old Shirley Ledford, using deception and force to lure them into the van, before subjecting them to prolonged torture at remote locations in the San Gabriel Mountains. Some of the instruments used against the victims, including pliers and an ice pick, were tools commonly found in an ordinary toolbox, which gave the pair their name in press coverage. The men recorded audio during at least one of the attacks, a tape later played for jurors that reportedly reduced courtroom observers to tears. The bodies of Schaefer and Hall were never recovered. The investigation broke open after Norris described the crimes to an acquaintance who alerted police. Authorities arrested Norris on November 20th, 1979. Facing the likelihood of a capital sentence, Norris agreed to cooperate with prosecutors, providing a full account of the crimes and agreeing to testify against Bittaker in exchange for having the death penalty taken off the table. In 1980, Norris pleaded guilty to 5 counts of murder, along with charges of forcible rape and robbery, and was sentenced to 45 years to life in prison. Bittaker was convicted separately in March 1981 on 26 counts, including murder, kidnapping, conspiracy, rape, and weapons charges, and was sentenced to death. Norris was processed into the California correctional system and, as the state's high-security infrastructure expanded through the 1980s, was eventually transferred to Pelican Bay State Prison. Given the violent and highly publicized nature of his crimes and the standing threat of retaliation from other inmates, prison officials maintained close oversight of his housing assignments throughout his incarceration. Norris was found unsuitable for parole at his first hearing in 2009, and again at a subsequent hearing in March 2019, with the board declining to schedule another hearing until 2029. Throughout his incarceration, Norris maintained that his cooperation had spared the families of his victims a longer, more painful trial, a position that did little to soften the parole board's view of the case each time it came up for review. His agreement to testify remained a point of controversy for decades afterward, with some investigators and victims' relatives arguing that a man responsible for 5 murders should never have been offered a path off death row, regardless of what his testimony delivered against Bittaker. Norris remained incarcerated at Pelican Bay for decades, until declining health prompted his transfer to a medical facility. On February 24, 2020, Roy Norris died of natural causes at age 72 at the California Medical Facility in Vacaville. His crime partner, Lawrence Bittaker, had died on death row at San Quentin roughly 2 months earlier, in December 2019, closing out both halves of a partnership that had terrorized Southern California for 5 months in 1979. Norris's death drew renewed attention to a case that, more than 40 years after the crimes, still stood among the most disturbing in the state's history, in large part because of the recorded evidence that had put both men away for good. Case number 3. Joe Pegleg Morgan. By the early 1970s, California's state prison system was experiencing unprecedented levels of internal gang conflict. Central to this power dynamic was the Mexican Mafia, an organization formed decades earlier inside a youth correctional facility to control illicit prison economies. While the group's membership was overwhelmingly Hispanic, one of its most powerful strategists was a man of Croatian descent who rose through the ranks on the strength of his connections and tactical mind. His name was Joseph Morgan, known across the system as Pegleg. Morgan was born Joseph Medjugorje on April 10, 1929, in San Pedro, California, the youngest of 4 children born to Croatian immigrant parents. His father anglicized the family name to Morgan not long after his birth. Raised largely in a Hispanic neighborhood of East Los Angeles, Morgan assimilated early into the local street culture and acquired his nickname after losing a leg to gunfire as a teenager, which left him reliant on a prosthetic limb for the rest of his life. In 1946, at 17, he beat a man to death and was sentenced to 9 years at San Quentin State Prison. Paroled in 1955, he returned to custody the following year after an armed robbery at a bank in West Covina. Inside facilities including Folsom and San Quentin, Morgan's fluency in Spanish, criminal intellect, and willingness to enforce group discipline earned him standing within the Mexican Mafia that was unprecedented for a member outside its core ethnic base. The organization itself had formed decades earlier at a California youth facility as a self-protection clique among Hispanic inmates, and by the time Morgan rose through its ranks, it had hardened into a hierarchical criminal enterprise, reaching well beyond prison walls. By the mid to late 1970s, he had become one of the organization's most influential figures, coordinating operations, managing illicit trade, and brokering alliances with rival groups, including a loose non-aggression pact with the Aryan Brotherhood, built on their shared rivalry with the Black Guerrilla family. His connections to narcotic suppliers south of the border also helped establish the trafficking pipeline that would come to fund much of the organization's later operations. In 1971, Morgan was connected to what is considered the Mexican Mafia's first prison gang-inspired street execution in Los Angeles, the killing of a rival named Alfonso Solis, an act that cemented his standing as an enforcer willing to authorize violence outside prison walls, not just inside them. Law enforcement viewed him as a primary authority figure directing gang policy both inside prison and out, and his case would later become a cultural flashpoint when the 1992 film American Me featured a supporting character widely understood to be modeled on him. Morgan refused a personal visit from the film's director and star, Edward James Olmos, and went on to file a lawsuit against the studio, alleging the film misrepresented his history. When Pelican Bay opened its security housing unit in December 1989, prison authorities prioritized transferring high-ranking gang leaders into the new facility to break their operational networks. Morgan was among the first major figures moved into Pelican Bay's SHU, held in automated, isolated housing designed to prevent communication with outside associates or general population inmates. Despite the SHU's physical controls, law enforcement intelligence reports maintained that senior leaders, Morgan among them, continued attempting to route coded messages through legal mail and visiting channels. Pelican Bay's entire SHU design, automated doors, perforated steel that let guards see in without giving inmates a clear line of sight out, and cells built with no windows to the outside, was shaped in large part by cases like Morgan's, where physical incarceration alone had proven insufficient to stop a leader from directing an organization from within. Even confined to an 8 by 10-foot cell for over 22 hours a day, intelligence officials continued to treat Morgan as an active threat to institutional order for years after his transfer. In late 1993, Morgan's health began to fail. On October 4, he was transferred out of Pelican Bay to the hospital ward at California State Prison, Corcoran. On October 27, doctors diagnosed him with inoperable liver cancer. His wife petitioned for compassionate release, but the process had not concluded by the time Morgan died at Corcoran on November 8, 1993, at the age of 64. Some accounts from inside the Mexican Mafia's ranks would later allege that Morgan's illness was not naturally occurring, claiming he had grown too powerful and was poisoned by prison authorities, though no evidence has ever substantiated that theory, and his official cause of death remains liver cancer. His decades directing Mexican Mafia operations from behind bars, and the intelligence failures his case exposed, fed directly into the design philosophy behind Pelican Bay's isolation protocols in the years that followed. Case number 4. Ren boxer Enriquez. During the 1980s and into the 1990s, the fight for control inside California's maximum security facilities reached its peak. High-ranking members of organized prison groups directed street operations, enforced internal discipline, and targeted rivals through coded communication networks that reached far beyond the prison walls. One of the most active figures operating at this level was Ren Enriquez, known in law enforcement circles as Boxer, a high-ranking lieutenant within the Mexican Mafia, whose later choices would make him one of the most closely studied informants in the organization's history. Enriquez was born on December 13, 1962, and raised in Cerritos, California. He was jumped into a local street gang around age 12 and drifted further into violent crime as a teenager, accumulating convictions for armed robbery and assault. While serving early sentences in the 1980s, Enriquez formally joined the Mexican Mafia. In December 1989, while out on parole, he ordered the killing of a 28-year-old woman he suspected of withholding drug proceeds from the organization. He was also connected to the shooting of a fellow Mexican Mafia member and an attack on another inmate. In 1993, Enriquez was convicted of 2 counts of murder, along with related conspiracy and assault charges, and was sentenced to 20 years to life. Prior to his conviction, Enriquez had risen quickly through the Mexican Mafia's ranks on the strength of his willingness to carry out violence on the organization's behalf, eventually becoming one of its recognized shot callers with authority over multiple street gangs that answered to the prison-based leadership. That same year, state corrections officials transferred him to Pelican Bay's security housing unit. For close to a decade, he lived under total isolation, spending over 22 hours a day in a windowless concrete cell. Despite these restrictive conditions, federal authorities later identified Enriquez as one of several high-ranking figures who managed to maintain operational influence over street factions using coded letters and legal visits to pass instructions outside the walls. By 2002, after years inside Pelican Bay SHU and growing disillusioned with the organization's internal politics, Enriquez made a decision that surprised both law enforcement and his former associates. He voluntarily dropped out of the Mexican Mafia and began cooperating with investigators. Over the following years, he sat for hundreds of hours of debriefing sessions with federal agents and state prosecutors, providing an unprecedented account of the gang's internal structure, financial operations, and communication methods. His testimony became a cornerstone of numerous federal racketeering indictments and law enforcement training programs across the country, and he was moved out of the general SHU population into protective custody because of the risk his cooperation created. Corrections officials took unusual measures to protect him over the years, at one point booking him into custody under a false name on a minor bogus charge to shield his location. And in 2015, the Los Angeles Police Department deployed SWAT officers and a helicopter to secure a downtown venue so Enriquez could brief a room of police chiefs and business leaders on the gang's structure and growth. Enriquez became eligible for parole consideration years into his cooperation, and parole panels recommended his release multiple times starting in the mid-2010s. 3 separate times, Governor Jerry Brown overruled those recommendations, arguing that Enriquez remained a danger to public safety despite his cooperation and the associate's degree and paralegal certificate he had earned while incarcerated. Enriquez's attorney pushed back on a recurring argument used against his release, that he might be safer inside prison than out, given his history as an informant. She argued that whatever risk he faced from former associates was his own to accept, not a legal basis for the state to keep him confined indefinitely. Governor Newsom blocked his release as well when the question came before him, writing at the time that Enriquez's continued path toward rehabilitation was encouraging, but that his current risk to public safety was still too high to approve release. In 2022, following another parole board recommendation, the state allowed the decision to stand, and Enriquez was released after roughly 29 years in custody, a period that had spanned his rise inside the Mexican Mafia, his years in Pelican Bay's SHU, and nearly 2 decades of cooperation with federal and state investigators. Since his release, he has continued cooperating with prosecutors pursuing Mexican Mafia leadership cases and has spoken publicly, including in recorded interviews, about the internal workings of the organization he once helped run from inside Pelican Bay's isolation unit, framing his ongoing cooperation as an attempt to make amends for a body of violence that, by his own account, extended well beyond the 2 murders that sent him to prison. Case number 5, Hugo Pinell. On August 21, 1971, an escape attempt inside San Quentin State Prison resulted in one of the deadliest single events in California penal history. 6 people, including 3 correctional officers and prominent inmate George Jackson, were killed during the confrontation. Among the men involved was a 26-year-old inmate serving a life sentence for rape, a man whose ongoing conflict with prison authority would ultimately result in one of the longest continuous stretches of solitary confinement in modern American corrections. His name was Hugo Pinell. Pinell was born on March 10, 1945, in Puerto Cabezas, Nicaragua, and immigrated to the United States as a child. In 1965, At age 20, he was convicted of rape with force and sentenced to life with the possibility of parole. Inside prison, Pinell became involved in political organizing tied to the Black Guerrilla family and repeated violent confrontations with staff and rival inmate groups, developing a reputation as one of the few Latino inmates fully integrated into a movement built around Black radical politics behind bars. Roughly 6 years into his sentence, he killed a correctional officer, adding a second life sentence to his record and establishing him as one of the most closely watched individuals in the state system. Following the 1971 San Quentin uprising, Pinell was tried alongside 5 co-defendants: Johnny Larry Spain, David Johnson, Willie Tate, Fleta Drumgo, and Luis Talamantes, in a proceeding that became known as the Trial of the San Quentin Six. The trial lasted more than 500 days, produced roughly 20,000 pages of testimony, and cost the state over $2 million, making it one of the longest and most expensive criminal trials in California history at the time. Tate, Drumgo, and Talamantes were acquitted outright. Pinell was convicted of assaulting 2 correctional officers during the incident, adding a 3rd consecutive sentence to his record, while Spain and Johnson were also convicted and later paroled in 1991 and 1993, respectively, leaving Pinell as the only member of the group still behind bars decades later. As California expanded its high-security infrastructure over the following decades, corrections officials classified Pinell as an extreme security risk, moving him through isolation units at Folsom, Doyle Vocational Institution, and Corcoran. He survived multiple assassination attempts by other inmates over the years, including stabbings, an improvised firearm attack, and an explosive device thrown into his cell, most of them tied to members of the Aryan Brotherhood, who targeted him over his history with the Black Guerrilla family and his association with George Jackson. In 1990, Pinell was transferred into Pelican Bay's security housing unit. He spent the next 24 consecutive years housed inside the SHU's total isolation blocks, a span that made his case a central focus of human rights campaigns and civil rights litigation, including Ashker versus Governor of California, which challenged the state's use of indefinite solitary confinement. Throughout his decades in isolation, Pinell maintained a strict personal regimen of physical exercise and writing, and continued applying for parole despite repeated denials tied to his institutional record, including a 9th denial in 2009. The Ashker litigation, filed on behalf of inmates who had spent a decade or more in Pelican Bay SHU, argued that indefinite solitary confinement based on gang validation rather than specific rule violations amounted to a constitutional violation. The case settled in 2015, forcing sweeping changes to how California classified and housed its highest security inmates, and by the time it resolved, nearly 1,000 prisoners had already been moved out of SHU housing across the state as officials responded to the mounting legal and public pressure. In 2014, ahead of that settlement, Pinell was transferred out of total isolation and placed into general population housing at California State Prison, Sacramento, often called New Folsom, in part because Pinell himself had helped broker a 2012 agreement among white, Black, and Hispanic prisoners aimed at reducing interracial violence, a fact his attorney later pointed to as evidence he should have been considered for a safer transition than an open yard. Within days of that transfer, on August 12, 2015, 39 years to the day after his conviction as one of the San Quentin Six, 71-year-old Pinell was fatally stabbed by fellow inmates during an altercation in the exercise yard. The attack triggered a broader riot at the facility and drew scrutiny over why an inmate with his history had been placed in general population at all, with his family later filing a wrongful death lawsuit alleging prison officials knew he was a target and failed to protect him. His death marked the end of a 50-year incarceration, more than half of which had been spent inside a single isolated cell block at Pelican Bay. Every case in this file was defined by the same remote concrete matrix built deep in the redwoods of Norte County. What remains is the record each of them left behind. Cary Stayner turned a summer-long search around a national park into one of the largest federal manhunts in state history and remains under a death sentence whose enforcement California has suspended indefinitely. Roy Norris spent 4 decades inside the system after his own admissions helped secure a life sentence for his role in a 5-month killing spree in 1979. Joe Morgan used his tactical intellect to direct a powerful organization from inside total isolation, prompting the very isolation protocols built to contain him. Protocols that ultimately held him until his final transfer out of Pelican Bay. René Enriquez spent nearly a decade in Pelican Bay SHU before his debriefings gave federal law enforcement its most detailed look inside the Mexican Mafia's hierarchy, cooperation that, after 3 governors weighed in on his fate, eventually bought him his release. And Hugo Pinell spent 24 consecutive years inside a single isolation block, his case becoming a central argument in the legal fight over solitary confinement before his life ended just days after he finally reached the general population yard. The concrete walls are still there. The fog still rolls in off the Pacific coast every morning, blanketing the high-voltage perimeter fences. The policies surrounding solitary housing have shifted over the decades, but the facility built to hold California's most high-risk individuals remains. An isolated outpost at the far northern edge of the state, where the sentence, more often than not, has been total isolation. That's Prison Files. Tell us in the comments which case, or which facility, you want open next.